Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Separating children from their parents is a form of trauma. We call it toxic stress when you have such an early childhood trauma that it actually disrupts your brain development. It causes irreparable harm. These children will suffer from long-term mental health conditions that may be impossible to fix later on.
Over 900. That's the number of migrant children who remain separated from their parents despite today's court-ordered deadline to reunify all families separated by the U.S. government at the U.S. border. We'll head to the U.S.-Mexico border for the latest, then speak to Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the Flint, Michigan pediatrician who helped expose the dangerous levels of lead in Flint's drinking water. We'll talk to her about the trauma of child separation, the Muslim travel ban, and the Flint water crisis.
When a pediatrician hears the word lead, it's a call to action. We know what lead does. It's probably the most well-studied neurotoxins known to man. It impacts cognition and behavior and alters a child's entire life course trajectory. It's already a form of environmental racism. Our kids in Flint already had higher lead levels, just like kids in Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia. It impacts them forever. So when I heard that there was potentially lead in the water, that really started kind of my quest to see if that lead in the water was getting into the bodies of our children.
We'll speak to Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha as a new report finds the death toll from the water crisis in Flint may be higher than Michigan officials have acknowledged. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 900 children forcibly separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border have yet to be reunited as the Trump administration faces today's deadline for family reunification set by a federal judge. Federal officials say some 463 separated parents have been deported since Trump launched a zero-tolerance border policy, even as their children remain in U.S. detention centers. Administration officials say the parents voluntarily agreed to leave their children behind. But in court papers filed Wednesday, the ACLU argued many parents say they were coerced or misled into signing forms they could not read and were confused about what they were agreeing to. After headlines, we'll speak with two immigration lawyers who've been representing immigrant parents separated from their children. In New York City, 8 people were arrested as protesters targeted the Manhattan home of J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon in a nonviolent civil disobedience action. The protesters attempted to deliver a petition from more than 100,000 immigrant rights advocates calling on Chase to divest from for-profit prisons and detention centers.
Family separations are not just happening at the border. They're also happening here. We need Jamie Dimon and J.P. Morgan Chase to step up and divest from private prisons and detention centers. It is inhumane for our communities to be ripped apart.
J.P. Morgan Chase has invested tens of millions of dollars in both Core Civic and Geo Group for-profit prison companies that also operate immigrant detention centers. At the White House, President Donald Trump said Wednesday he's reached a deal to halt a burgeoning trade war with the European Union. This is President Trump speaking in the White House Rose Garden after a meeting with European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker.
We agreed today, first of all, to work together towards zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies on non-auto industrial goods. Thank you.
Trump had few details on his agreement with Juncker, but claimed the EU would buy more U.S. soybeans and said he would work to reverse tariffs he put in place on imports of European steel and aluminum. Wednesday's surprise joint appearance by Trump and Juncker in the Rose Garden came after the White House banned CNN correspondent Caitlin Collins from the event. Collins says earlier Wednesday she was summoned to the office of Bill Shine, the former Fox News executive who was recently named White House communications chief. Collins says Shine accused her of shouting and asking inappropriate questions during an earlier joint appearance by Trump and Juncker in the White House. This is an excerpt of that appearance.
Mr. President, are you worried about what Michael Cohen is going to say to prosecutors? Are you worried about what is on the other table? tapes, Mr. President?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody.
Why is Unrwa not accepting your recommendation?
The White House Correspondents Association strongly condemned Collins' exclusion from Trump's appearance in the Rose Garden as inappropriate, wrong-headed, and weak. Even Fox News weighed in, with network president Jay Wallace saying, "We stand in strong solidarity with CNN for the right to full access for our journalists as part of a free and unfettered press," the Fox chief said. The incident came just one day after Trump drew comparisons to George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 with these remarks to Veterans of Foreign Wars convention in Kansas City.
Just stick with us. Don't believe the crap you see from these people, the fake news. And just remember, what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening.
In Pakistan, vote counting is underway after Wednesday's general election, with early returns showing former cricket star Imran Khan building a commanding lead to be the next prime minister of Pakistan. Opposition groups, including the party of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, are rejecting the results, alleging vote rigging, and saying that Pakistan's powerful military unfairly sided with Khan. Wednesday's vote proceeded amidst heavy security after a string of attacks on voters left scores dead, including a bombing in the northwestern city of Quetta Wednesday that killed 31 people and an attack on a polling station in Baluchistan that killed 4 others. In Syria, a series of gun attacks and suicide bomb blasts claimed by ISIS killed at least 216 people Wednesday in one of the group's worst assaults yet inside Syria. The violence was centered in Syria's southwest, where ISIS launched an offensive on villages surrounding the city of Sueda before suicide attackers targeted a crowded marketplace inside the provincial capital. The ISIS attacks came amidst a Syrian military offensive that's brought most of Daraa province under Syrian government control. Saudi Arabia has temporarily suspended oil shipments through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, separating the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean, after Houthi rebels in Yemen reportedly launched attacks on a pair of tankers, causing damage to one. The state-owned Saudi Aramco oil company said no one was injured in the attacks and that no oil spilled, but the halt in shipments caused oil prices to increase worldwide. This comes as the UK-based charity Save the Children warned Yemen is likely to see a spike in cholera cases as hot summertime conditions favor a resurgence of the waterborne illness. At least 3,000 new cholera cases were reported in the first week of July alone, after more than 1 million people contracted cholera last year. Yemen's experiencing the worst humanitarian crisis in the world as a U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition bombing campaign has devastated Yemen's infrastructure and helped push millions of Yemenis to the brink of famine. In the Gaza Strip, a tentative ceasefire broke down Wednesday as Israeli airstrikes and tank fire killed 3 Palestinians and injured 1 other. The assaults came after Israel says a Palestinian sniper injured one of its soldiers at a post along Israel's heavily militarized border in southern Gaza. Meanwhile, the UN agency assisting Palestinian refugees, known as UNRWA, said Wednesday it's laying off 250 workers after the Trump administration slashed $300 million in funding. The announcement set off protests by trade unionists who said as many as 1,000 people could ultimately be let go. In one incident, bystanders intervened to stop a fired UNRWA employee from setting himself ablaze after he doused himself in gasoline in an apparent attempt at self-immolation. This is laid-off UNRWA employee Amal Al-Bach.
This is a humanitarian disaster. This is disrespectful to the people and to the workers who provide these services. The services are also under threat. What kind of services will UNRWA give after it fires its workers? I think there will be poor services in health and education that will not meet humane standards.
The White House said Wednesday President Trump's planned meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and this fall will be delayed until next year, after the midterm elections. Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, said the administration would wait until special counsel Robert Mueller contemplates his investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, which Bolton called a witch hunt. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo defended President Trump's July 16th Helsinki summit with President Putin, refusing to say what the two discussed behind closed doors with only a pair of translators present. This is New Jersey's Bob Menendez, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, questioning Pompeo.
We don't know what the truth is. And the only way that we will know what the truth is, what transpired in those 2 hours, in a highly amazing period of time to spend alone, one-on-one, is by understanding at least that if you were briefed by the president, what he told you. I don't think that's unfair to know, to understand what policy is.
Senator, presidents are permitted to have conversations with their cabinet members that aren't repeated in public. I owe the president the capacity for him to have conversations with him, provide him the best foreign policy advice that I can. It's what I was
Let me ask you this.
A federal judge ruled Wednesday that a lawsuit charging President Trump with violating an anti-corruption provision of the U.S. Constitution can proceed. The lawsuit, which was brought by the attorneys general of Baltimore and the District of Columbia, contends Trump violated the Constitution's emoluments clause by receiving payments from foreign governments through the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. It was the first ever ruling by a federal court defining emoluments and could bolster two similar lawsuits targeting Trump's business dealings. In Mexico, press freedom groups are calling on the government to thoroughly investigate the death of journalist and media owner Rubén Pat, who was fatally shot 6 times Tuesday in the southern Mexican state of Quintana Roo. The assassination came even though Pat was enrolled in a journalist protection scheme organized by the Mexican government. He's at least the 7th journalist killed in Mexico this year. And employees of the investigative news outlet The Intercept have ratified their first-ever union contract. The deal, which has the unanimous support of members of the Writers Guild of America East, guarantees workers pay increases and paid parental leave. And in a first-of-its-kind provision, the deal guarantees future interviews for job openings must include at least 2 candidates from traditionally underrepresented groups in journalism, including women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ community. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. It's been 9 weeks since the Trump administration sparked a national crisis by forcibly separating more than 2,500 migrant children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border. Most were seeking asylum from violence in their home countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Instead, the parents were charged in federal court with a crime for illegally crossing the border, then held in jail and detention. The children, some still breastfeeding, were taken away from their parents, sent to shelters around the country. Today is the deadline federal district judge Dana Sabraw set to reunite these families. But the process has been chaotic, and the government admits that still at least 900 children have yet to be reunited, and some 463 separated parents have been deported, even as their children remain in U.S. detention centers. Officials say the parents voluntarily agreed to leave their children behind. But in court papers filed Wednesday, the ACLU argued many parents say they were coerced or misled into signing forms they could not read and were confused about what they were agreeing to. Most of the parents are held at the Port Isabel Detention Center in South Texas as they wait to reunite with their children. Many have their requests for asylum heard by an immigration judge at a court inside the jail. On Wednesday, CNN published audio of a mother pleading with Judge Robert Powell. This is an excerpt.
To please give me an opportunity to remain here in this country. I need to save my life and the life of my son. I cannot go back to my country because over there, the police, when I went to the police, they did nothing to help me.
Having considered all the evidence, the court finds you have not established a significant possibility that you could establish eligibility for asylum or withholding of removal under the immigration laws of the United States.
For more, we're joined by 2 immigration lawyers who've been representing and providing pro bono assistance to parents separated from their children, some of whom still have not been reunited by today's court-imposed deadline. In Washington, D.C., Ofelia Calderon is with us. She has a client who was reunited with her daughter, but they're now being held in family detention. She's on the Advisory Council of Legal Aid Justice Center and on the board of the Dulles Justice Coalition. And in McAllen, Texas, we're joined joined by Carlos Garcia. Of his two clients, one was reunited with her 6-year-old son earlier this month. The other reunited Wednesday at Port Isabel, just hours ahead of the deadline. As we speak, a march of immigrant children and families is on its way to the U.S. Capitol, where they plan to hold a sit-in to demand all the families be reunited and released. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Carlos Garcia, can you give us an update on your client, Brenda, and her daughter? Tell us who they are.
Brenda is from Guatemala, and she was fleeing. Her 13-year-old daughter has been detained in Arizona. They've been detained collectively for over a month and 2 weeks. Yesterday afternoon, when I found out that Brenda's daughter was on a flight from Arizona to South Texas to meet her mom, I drove out to the Port Isabel Detention Center, hoping that I actually wouldn't be able to see Brenda because I wanted her to be on the way out of the detention center. Unfortunately, I was able to see her, but actually that gave me hope because I talked to her and she felt positive. I came home and at night I got a phone call from a person who was sharing a cell inside the detention center with Brenda at about 7:30 p.m. last night, indicating that the government had taken Brenda out of the detention center, and that's as far as I've heard. I'm hoping that this morning when I go check at the shelter here where a lot of people are being dropped off and being housed at Catholic Charities, that I'll find her there.
So can you tell us how these reunifications happen? They happen in the parking lot?
Right. Yesterday, when I was leaving the Port Isabel Detention Center, actually, I walked out and to my right, there was a big bus, and I saw families, moms and dads walking in to the bus, and presumably they were headed down to the shelter where they're staying, and it was occurring right outside in the parking lot.
I want to bring Ophelia Calderon into the conversation in Washington, D.C. Can you tell us the people that you're representing? Can you tell us the stories of kids who were reunited with their parents and then some of whom still have not been reunited?
Well, I can. Thank you for asking that question. Most of my information right now is very up to date to the extent that my own client, Betsy, for example, was also detained at Port Isabel. She was then transferred to the South Texas Detention Center in Pearsall, which is also an adult facility. And I have to say that a number of other mothers and fathers from Port Isabel were transferred up to that San Antonio facility, I believe because their children must have been in shelters or foster care situations nearby. After a few days, they were then transferred to the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas, and that is where my client was reunited with her daughter. So her daughter was actually not in a shelter. She was in a foster care situation. They brought her to Dilley, and that is when they reunited. My understanding is that that happened for a large number. There are still people that we are in contact with, parents who are in contact with at both Pearsall and also at Port Isabel, who are still awaiting reunification, sadly. And, I mean, obviously this is a situation that we're all monitoring to figure out when and how the reunifications are going to occur.
Can you talk about your client, Betty? You say she was pressured by ICE to do what?
I mean, it did appear for some period of time that Betty was being pressured to sign a document that would authorize her deportation. Let me say this, that Betty is not the only person who brought this piece of paper to my attention and to the attention, I think, of other media outlets as well. There was a period of time where many parents were being shown a piece of paper and asked to sign it. So their options were basically one, and I think this is where the confusion lies, is because most of them said to me, and of course I didn't see this piece of paper, they were telling me this from the jails. Option one was, do you agree to be deported and reunited with your child outside? Option two was, do you agree to be deported but reunited with your child before? And option three was, do you want to speak to your lawyer? So this is how it was explained to me. And obviously, like, the questions that arose from that for the parents were, okay, so if I sign this piece that says I agree, will I be reunited with my child or not? And it seemed to be the only option for reunification, some form of deportation either before or after. And that was very confusing for them. And in some ways, for example, with Betty, it was somewhat coercive to the extent that officers would return to her. She obviously would check off the box that said, I want to speak to my lawyer. And when an officer would return to her, that officer would say, don't you want to be with your child? Don't you want to be reunified with your child? Of course, Betty wants to be reunified with her child. But at the same time, she also didn't understand what choosing what one of these options would mean. And frankly, neither did I.
Carlos Garcia, what does it mean when the government says hundreds of people are not eligible to reunite with their children?
Right. There's so much confusion about that. We don't know. As of Friday, I was in touch with a couple of lawyers who are litigating these lawsuits, and they had indicated that perhaps my client had been identified as a person not eligible for reunification. So I was very worried. But the reality is that who knows if that was true or not, based on any kind of definition, because we are not getting any kind of information as to what that means. I wish we knew, so that there was a way that we could address that, so that there was a way that we could advocate for our clients if indeed they were identified as not eligible for reunification. But that's a definition that the government has not provided to us.
Carlos, can you talk about your client, Lucy, who you successfully got released earlier this month and has been reunited with her 6-year-old son? The personal impact this crisis has had on you, your mother inviting Lucy to her house after she was released earlier this month, cooking her dinner. You're at ground zero of this, really what many are calling an immigrant kidnapping crisis, and the kidnapper, the U.S. government.
Yeah, I don't think that's a far stretch of what it is. I talked to Lucy just yesterday afternoon, and she was with her son there in the Dallas area. They were coloring, doing some reading of work. It was, when you asked me to talk about what I felt, what it was felt like to be able to share this moment with my mom. It's very touching, because the stories that Lucy was telling us were horrific. The treatment that she received when she entered the United States was just devastating. She had just fled from a country with her son, seeking some good opportunities from a country which she felt was going to afford that. And unfortunately, our government ended up taking her child away from her, and she wasn't able to see him for approximately a month. She wasn't able to talk to him for about 20 days, which was also devastating to her. And so it's just it's very exhausting emotionally, and we're lucky and we're fortunate to have been able to help her.
And what has Lucy told you about her son adapting now, her child? I mean, so many stories we've heard, psychologists putting out brochures on the effect of the trauma of separation.
You know, when I met this little boy, a 6-year-old boy, and he exited the shelter where he was detained, he was really strong. He was very optimistic. He asked if we could go eat some pizza, and so we did. And then he was just he was very upbeat. But I've talked to Lucy since then. She said that he's been talking now about his experience of being in a detention center, and he's remembering some of the things that, he's remembering some of the things that occurred while he was in there, especially missing his mom and not being able to communicate very well with his mom. And that's been extremely sad for him. She's glad he's getting it off his shoulder, off his chest, but you can tell her voice changes when she starts talking about that, because it's very sad. I
want to go back to the audio CNN published Wednesday of a mother detained at Port Isabel pleading with an immigration judge, Robert Powell, at a court inside the jail. She requested asylum but was denied. Data shows Judge Powell denies nearly 80% of asylum claims he hears, well above the national average of about 50% denials. This is an excerpt of the mother explaining to the judge she was distracted during her interview about her request for asylum.
I want to say also that when I had the interview, some questions I did understand and others I did not. At that time, I was feeling very desperate because the officers first asked me about my son. I was separated from him. My son remained back at the icebox. He was left on the floor. I did not know anything about my son when they interviewed me.
In that case, Judge Powell denied the mother's asylum requests and ordered her to be deported. Ophelia Calderon, can you elaborate on this as we wrap up and what the parents face?
On the process, I mean, you know, this is something that I think is that we need to be aware of in terms of how that process works. That's exactly right. I mean, the process when you come to the United States is that you go through what's called a credible fear interview, and you demonstrate that there's a significant possibility that you're going to be subject to persecution. And I want to put that in context because once you pass that interview, you then go on to apply for asylum, for which the standard is essentially, when you break it down into sort of layman's terms, is that you need to demonstrate that there's a 10% possibility, at least a 10% possibility that you're going to be persecuted on one of the 5 grounds. So, I mean, when you're at the CFI level, you know, honestly, the fact that you're able to articulate that persecution and a reason why should be sufficient to pass. There did seem to be in Port Isabel during this time period a blanket negative across the board, and that was really shocking. I have to say that also happened to my own client Betty, who has a significant set of facts with a good claim. Subsequently, if you don't pass that interview, you have the opportunity to have your case reviewed by an immigration judge, and that's what we just heard. We heard an immigration judge not really, you know, thinking about what that really meant. And that's what I saw when I was in Port Isabel. That's what I saw with the cases that I represented people on at the IJ review level. I didn't see real review. I didn't see real process. And that's terrifying for our system as a whole.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Ophelia Calderon, the Carlos Garcia, immigration lawyers representing and providing pro bono assistance to parents separated from their children, some of whom still have not been reunited. More than 900 children still separated from their families. This is Democracy Now! Stay with us.
Nobody wants you, nobody cares, nobody likes you, nobody dares to extend a greeting, a connecting glance. Life is just a jaded game to them. They will give it a chance. But you know, and I know, that the galaxies are all around us, and life will flow on.
Freedom is Free by Chicano Batman here in our Democracy Now! Studios. This is Democracy Now! As more than 900 children remain separated from their parents, we turn to Dr. Mona Hanat-Tisha, a pediatrician from Flint, Michigan, who helped expose the dangerous levels of lead in Flint's drinking water after testing blood lead levels in children. In 2016, Time magazine named Mona one of the 100 most influential people in the world. The Iraqi-American doctor has just published a new book titled What the Eyes Don't See, a story of crisis, resistance, and hope in an American city. Later in the show, we'll discuss the Flint water crisis with her. But I first asked her about the health impacts of migrant children being separated from their families.
As a pediatrician, I applaud my pediatrician colleagues who have been very vocal on this issue. Separating children from their parents is a form of trauma. We call it toxic stress when you have such an early childhood trauma that it actually disrupts your brain development. It causes irreparable harm. These children will suffer from long-term mental health conditions that may be impossible to fix later on. It is absolutely not recommended, not only as speaking as a pediatrician, speaking as a mom, speaking as a human. And this is the same kind of toxic stress that we've actually framed our water crisis in Flint. Not only was it exposure to lead, but it was exposure to all of this adversity and the trauma of the crisis being betrayed by government. This is the same kind of toxic stress children who are in schools and these active shooters feel. This is all traumas. And it's makes you only wonder, how do we value our children if we are pulling them apart at the border, if we are exposing them to toxins in communities, if we have, incredibly high rates of childhood poverty, the highest of all industrialized countries, and look at our gun violence. I think this is a reckoning for many of us, especially those of us who are pediatricians who know the science of what this does to children.
And separating children at the border is really intimately linked to the travel ban that President Trump has imposed. About over a year ago, you wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times. Its headline, "Will we lose the doctor who would stop the next Flint?" You write in it, 18 months ago as a pediatrician here, I discovered that the untreated tap water corroding the city's plumbing was poisoning our children with lead. State officials called my science faulty and accused me of creating hysteria, but I was right and persisted. And with brave parents, pastors, journalists, and scientists demanded answers until this continuing public health disaster was finally acknowledged. You go on a few paragraphs down to say, but as a first-generation Iraqi immigrant and as a doctor whose job is to train other doctors, many of them immigrants themselves, I fear that the American dream is corroding. I worry about the impact of President Trump's travel ban, for the moment blocked by court order, and how the Republican Congress will handle immigration issues. Take it from there. Talk about your own personal experience, how you ended up in this country.
Absolutely. And this is definitely a big part of my book is my immigrant story. So we came to this country when I was 4. We are Iraqi American. I was born in the UK, but my parents were fleeing Iraq. It was a time that Saddam Hussein was rising in power. My parents are leftists, progressives. They saw what was happening to their country. They knew if they went home that they would face a very, very different future. So we came to this country fleeing dictatorship and tyranny and fascism. We came to this country looking for democracy and freedom and opportunity. And that American dream was absolutely realized for me and my family. Lady Liberty opened her arms, and we were welcomed into this country. And I grew up confident and competent and committed to service and committed to being part of this country and serving this country, recognizing the privilege I have of being in this country every single day. And that is the lens that I see the world, and that's the lens of how I do my work and how I have committed to this work. And it makes you wonder of those other 4-year-olds, those other little kids we are literally closing our doors upon. What are we going to miss out? How many Nobel Prize winners from the U.S. have been immigrants recently? The majority were immigrants. We are all essentially immigrants, except the Native Americans and those who were forcibly brought here. It is absolutely frightening to see what our future holds with these policies.
Finally, you also give us major history lessons in your book titled What the Eyes Don't See. And you talk about the sit-down strikes of Flint in the 1930s and other collective actions.
Absolutely.
Talk about that here.
So there is quite a bit of history in my book because we often do not see that history as we walk through the places that we live. Yet they frame, our actions and they frame our current state. So Flint, many people don't know, Flint is the birthplace of the middle class, the birthplace of the American dream. Not only was General Motors born there, but it was the actions of brave, heroic, disobedient workers who demanded their fair share of the economy. And sat down for 44 days in car plants and birthed the United Auto UAW. And it was their brave actions that really informed wages across the country. At one point, Flint actually had the highest per capita income in the country, some of the lowest unemployment rates, some of the best public health indices because of the actions of these workers. So we need to know that history because it definitely informs Flint, but informs really all of our actions. So there's quite a bit of public health history. There's a lot of lead history, the evil lead history in there.
And on continuing on the public health history and the activist history of the 1930s, you yourself have a personal connection. If you can talk about was it your great uncle?
Yeah, my great uncle was a freedom fighter. He came to Cambridge in the 1930s to to MIT.
Nuri
Raphael. He came to and was so engaged in the resistance that was happening at Cambridge. He came on a scholarship. He actually lost a scholarship because he was too involved in activism, and went back to Iraq and started a leftist organization in Iraq, and then fought all over the world. He went to Palestine to fight for independence from England, and then he went on to Spain to be one of the freedom fighters in the International Brigade fighting fascism and Franco. His work was all about a borderless cause where he would go anywhere to fight for freedom, and this was amazingly my great uncle. So there's definitely some genetics in this work.
We'll be back with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha in 30 seconds.
Cuidando que todo brille como una perla. Cuando llegue la patrona, que no se vuelva a quejar. No sea cosa que la acuse de ilegal. Se atiende los jardines, parecen de Disneyland. Maneja una troca vieja.
El Hielo, Ice, by La Santa Cecilia, performing in Democracy Now! Studios. I'm Amy Goodman. A new report by PBS Frontline has found the death toll from the water crisis in Flint may be higher than Michigan officials have acknowledged. The state has admitted 12 people died following an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease after Flint switched its water supply to the Flint River in an attempt to save money. But according to PBS Frontline, the city also saw a spike in pneumonia deaths during the water crisis. Some of these deaths may have actually been caused by Legionnaires. Between April 2014 through October 2015, 119 people died of pneumonia in Flint, a jump of 46% from that same time period a year earlier. More than a dozen state and city officials are facing criminal charges in part for failing to alert the public to the risk of Legionnaire's disease during the Flint water crisis. On Wednesday, Nick Lyon, the former head of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, was in court for a hearing to determine whether he'll stand trial on manslaughter charges. Well, we spend the rest of the hour with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the Flint pediatrician who helped expose the dangerous levels of lead in Flint, Michigan's drinking water, after she tested blood lead levels in children. In 2016, Time magazine named Dr. Mona one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Her new book is titled What the Eyes Don't See, a story of crisis, resistance, and hope in an American city. She recently came to our studios. We sat down for an interview, and I asked her to describe the situation in Flint today.
Our water quality is definitely improving. It is absolutely getting better. Shortly after we released our findings that children's lead levels were elevated, we switched back to treated Great Lakes water. However, the 18 months that we were on that corrosive water ate up our pipes. It ate up our lead pipes, and they're being replaced. And replacing pipes doesn't happen overnight. We've replaced about 6,000. We have about 9,000 to go. And until those pipes are all replaced, people still need to be on filtered water or bottled water.
So let's go back to the beginning. Some people have heard about Flint water, maybe others haven't. But tell us the story of what actually took place.
Yeah. So Michigan has a crazy law that if you are in a near bankruptcy state, the state can swoop in and usurp democracy. Flint has been in crisis really for decades, financial crisis with disinvestment, unemployment, racism, poverty. And in 2011, the governor appointed a state-appointed emergency manager to come in with one purpose, and that purpose was austerity. It was save money, save money, save money, really no matter what the cost. And they decided that the water that we had been getting from Detroit, which was fresh Great Lakes water for half a century, was too expensive for this poor minority city that was near bankruptcy, and that instead we would start drawing water from the local Flint River until a new pipeline to the Great Lakes was to be built. But the critical error came where the water from the Flint River was not treated properly. The Flint River water may have been okay, but it was not treated with the necessary corrosion control. And without that medicine medicine, I think of it, that you put in the water treatment. It prevents the lead that is in all of our plumbing to come out of the plumbing and go into our drinking water.
So this corrosive water supply leached out the lead in the pipes.
Absolutely. So we were stubbornly slow as a nation to listen to science and to restrict lead in our plumbing. The lead industry was and continues to be absolutely evil. We still had regulations in place that could allow lead service lines until 1986, but not until 2014 did we restrict lead from our brass fixtures. So we have lead in all of our infrastructure. New York City actually has the most lead lines in the country. But if it's properly treated, it minimizes the lead release. Doesn't prevent it, but minimize it. So the corrosive water really just ate up the scale that was in those pipes and then released the lead that was already in that plumbing into the drinking water.
Now, it's not as if people weren't aware. I mean, we went to Flint. We met with the people who were marching in the streets who said the water smelled funny.
Absolutely.
It looked funny. Describe the water and what it took, and especially what you did.
Yeah, so the heroes of the story are the people of Flint. They were heroic and brave and loud, incredible activism and resistance. Right when the water switched, they said, hey, you know, the water looks gross. It tastes gross. It's brown. It smells like sewage. My kids are getting rashes. We had bacteria in the water. Then they dumped a lot of chlorine in the water to kill the bacteria. People felt that they were, you know, drinking a swimming pool. That excess chlorine caused high levels of chlorine byproducts, which are carcinogens that cause cancer. And then just a few months into this water switch, General Motors, which was born in Flint, stopped using this water because it was corroding their engine parts. So a full year before my research.
This is an amazing story. We went to the house of one of the union workers in Flint who worked at the engine plant.
Yeah.
And they got a waiver because they were getting corrosion on their engine parts, just saying, we can't sell these engines. So clearly the city and the state knew there was something wrong with the water. And here were the Flint workers at the plant saying, wait, if it's corroding our engines, what's happening to our bodies?
It is mind-boggling. And the state repeatedly just told people to relax. They literally said, if you have any concerns about lead in the water, you can relax. So I heard about the bacteria, I heard about the high levels of chlorine, but the state was reassuring everybody. And, I mean, who doesn't believe that the water that comes out of your tap in the 21st century is okay? And Michigan is literally, we are the mitten state. We are literally in the middle of the Great Lakes. Here's Flint, right there. We are middle of the largest source of fresh water in the world. 20% of the fresh water in the world.
You're holding up your hand, and you're showing Flint is right below your pointer finger.
Flint is right
next
here.
To your thumb.
Here's
right
Detroit. Here's Ann Arbor, here's Grand Rapids, and here's Flint. Literally in the middle of the largest source of fresh water in the world. Like, who would believe that in the 21st century, in the middle of the Great Lakes, that when you turn on your tap, that your water is not fine?
So, Dr. Mona, talk about where you were working at the time.
Sure. So I'm a pediatrician and a medical educator at our public children's hospital. And families would come in and see me, and they would be worried about the water. And I was reassuring families, telling them it's okay. Don't waste your money on bottled water. The state says everything is okay. And I wasn't tipped off until a high school girlfriend came over who happens to be a water expert. So at my home, not at work, with a glass of wine in my hand, and this high school girlfriend tells me, hey, Mona, the water's not being treated properly. I'm like, what are you talking about? Everybody says it's okay. How could the water not be okay? And she's like, well, there's no corrosion control. And if you're missing that ingredient, there's going to be lead in the water.
Was she from Flint?
She's not from Flint. Drinking water expert, formerly with the EPA in Metro Detroit. And that was the very first time with a glass of wine in my hand that I heard the possibility of lead in the water. And when a pediatrician hears the word lead, it's a call to action. We know what lead does. It's probably the most well-studied neurotoxins known to man. It impacts cognition and behavior and alters a child's entire life course trajectory. It's already a form of environmental racism. Our kids in Flint already had higher lead levels, just like kids in Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia. It impacts them forever. So when I heard that there was potentially lead in the water, that really started kind of my quest to see if that lead in the water was getting into the bodies of our children.
So talk about what you did.
I tried to get the data from both the county and the state. So lead is something that there's surveillance programs for. All the blood lead levels done at the anywhere in Michigan go to a surveillance system, just like we have surveillance for flu and HIV. I tried to get that surveillance data, but was blocked in every direction. So then decided to do my own research in our hospital, which sees really the most Flint kids. Pulled up those labs as quickly as possible and compared children's lead levels before the water switch to after the water switch, and noticed that contrary to really every trend that was happening at the national level, the state level, and even our city level, where lead levels had been going down for years because we got lead out of paint and gasoline, there was an increase. Even if it had stayed the same, it would have been alarming. And this was all a massive underestimation of exposure.
So then talk about what happened as you gathered the information. I mean, you had people, their hair was falling out, they had rashes.
Hair was falling out, worried about their children, all kinds of nondescript symptoms. The hard thing with environmental health exposures, especially lead, is you can't really pinpoint it. It doesn't have one symptom. Like, I wish it had like purple spots and, oh, that means you're exposed to lead. But it's known as a silent pediatric epidemic. You don't see the consequences of lead exposure for really years after exposure, and then often it's too late. So when we knew that we had this data, when we knew that we saw this increase in children's lead levels, and it was in the same geographic areas where the water lead levels were the highest, we tried to alert local officials. They were not interested in listening. So I held a press conference, and this is definitely not something doctors do. It's actually kind of a form of academic disobedience. You are supposed to release your research in journals and publications. It's supposed to go through a peer review process, which takes time. And our kids in Flint had no time.
Describe to us what happened when you got your numbers back before the news conference. What did you see? Where were you?
So I was in my office at the hospital with one of my co-researchers, another young woman, a young mom, and we got the data back that showed this increase in blood lead levels. And I tried every which way to prove that I was wrong. I was trying to be a statistical devil's advocate. I did not want to be right, because to be right, to have seen an increase in lead levels was dire for our children. That's not what these Flint kids need, who are already struggling with every adversity to their development, every obstacle to their success.
And so then you decided to hold this news conference.
Right, decided to hold a news conference. So literally walked out of the clinic and into this conference room, a press conference, to share this data.
I want to go to a clip of that news conference.
The percentage of children with elevated blood lead levels has increased. The most striking increase is in the zip codes with the highest water lead level.
So that's Dr. Monahana Atisha at a news conference announcing the results of the study she had done based on the kids of Flint. Dr. Monahana Atisha is a pediatrician in Flint, Michigan. Talk about the response to this news conference.
Yeah, so I shouldn't have been surprised, because everybody in the story who had raised a flag had been attacked. The incredible moms, the activists, the pastors, the journalists, the water scientists, everybody was dismissed, denied, and attacked. So when I shared this evidence, these facts, this proof that there was an alarming increase in children's blood lead levels, I was also attacked. I was called an unfortunate researcher, that I was causing near hysteria, which is one of my favorites because it was also blatantly sexist, and that I was splicing and dicing numbers, and that the state's data was not consistent with my data. So when the state attacks you, you feel like crap. And I doubted myself. I second-guessed myself. Maybe I was wrong. But I quickly realized that every single kid in my data, every number, every statistic was a child that I had probably cared for within that last year or so. And they gave me the strength to fight back, because this was not about numbers. This was about kids, and this was about the future of those kids.
So talk about your data versus the state's data.
Right.
So if you weren't wrong, they were wrong.
Yeah, so they were wrong. So they said that we know our numbers don't show this. It's not consistent with what your findings are. And there was about a week, 2 weeks of this back and forth, comparing data, fighting in the media. And then finally, the state's chief medical doctor called me. And she's like, tell me how you did your research. Like, let's have a physician-to-physician conversation, which means let's kind of cut the crap. What did you do? Share your research. And that really forced the state to go back and look at their data. And when they did go back and look at their data, they saw the same thing that I had seen.
So you had the governor's office, the governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder, attacking you. And then the next thing we see is a news conference of Governor Snyder, and you're standing at his side. Let's go to that news conference.
If you had contaminated water coming from your tap at home, should you have to pay for it?
Again, that's one of the questions that we'll be reviewing. Our
the question is, should you be paying for contaminated water if it came out of your tap?
We're addressing the immediate issue now, which is making sure people have water filters
and other resources.
You're not
answering my question, sir.
I'm answering your questions.
You're answering someone's question, but not mine.
Describe what happened then.
Yeah, so I will work with anybody who is willing to work for children. That is the constituency that I respond to. So the governor asked, it was his first visit in Flint with the new mayor who had just been elected, and they were discussing the situation and what needed to be done.
That was Dr. Karen Weaver, the psychologist, who sort of almost ran on a single plank. I'm going to deal with the water of Flint.
Absolutely. She's a pediatric psychologist, so is well aware of the consequences of a water crisis and unlead crisis. So I was standing at this press conference with the new mayor, with the governor, with many of his cabinet members, and they at that point had acknowledged the crisis, but were continuing to downplay the crisis. And although I was standing there and asked to be there with them, I couldn't agree with what they were saying. They were saying that only a few children were exposed. They were saying that it was by and large, the school's fault that there was high levels in the schools. It wasn't that it was the corrosive, untreated water's fault. So I very visibly shook my head. I'm like, this is not right, and in opposition to what they were saying.
Mm-hmm. So they cherry-pick their data. It's just not a matter of, they happen to have different conclusions than you, and then they call you up and they say, we should do it another way. This had been developing for a few years. People had been raising many concerns. So what did they leave out that you found?
Yeah, so actually in all these FOIA emails that eventually came out, the state health department had actually looked at children's blood levels that previous summer. So in the summer of 2015, they had actually analyzed blood levels from the summer of 2014 and actually saw a spike in children's blood levels, but didn't share that information. So that was another missed opportunity where this crisis could have been averted.
So explain what happened next. Governor Rick Snyder is still the governor of Michigan, but a number of his top aides have been indicted.
Yeah. There's been over 15 criminal charges. In addition to a lead crisis, we also had one of the largest outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease, which causes pneumonia and fatalities. People died. At least 12 people died from Legionnaire's disease, which was also due to this untreated water. There was an overall uptick in pneumonia, so there's some homicide charges because of that. There's been charges against the water quality, water treatment folks, people at the health department, the emergency managers, city officials. So there's been many investigations and ongoing efforts at the accountability.
Talk about the role of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is, to say the least, extremely relevant today in the Trump administration, the rollback of regulations. But this was not during the Trump administration.
This was during the Obama administration. The head of the EPA Region 5, which is where Michigan is, Susan Hedman, resigned because of this crisis. The EPA actually did their own internal report with their inspector general and noted that they should have acted 7 months sooner. There were heroic and brave, defiant folks at the EPA who were raising the alarm bells on what was happening in Flint, but they were also silenced. So there's a role of the EPA at fault. And it's concerning now because, the EPA is further being emasculated, with, almost being permanently dismantled with cuts in regulations and cuts in senior staff. So it's even more concerning that we will see many more Flints to come.
There was an EPA whistleblower. You have the head of the EPA stepping down, but there was someone who was willing to share his data with residents of Flint, so alarmed by what he saw.
There was a heroic EPA whistleblower. His name is Miguel Del Toro, and he came up to Flint after an amazing mom called him. Leanne Walters called him and said, "Hey, I think there's something wrong with my water." He drove up to Flint. He offered to use his own money to do testing in Flint. He inspected her whole house, and he wrote a damning report, a memo, in July of 2015, really early on, with alarm bells everywhere saying, "Hey, there is lead in Flint's water. We need to look into this." And he was silenced. The state called him a rogue employee. Susan Hedman apologized for his behavior, that he kind of stepped out of line. So there were folks at the EPA who were trying to do good.
And the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services Director Nick Lyons facing manslaughter charges.
Yes, this is because of the Legionnaires' outbreak.
What should they have done at the time, aside from not having switched the water supply?
Yeah, obviously, I wish I could press rewind and never have switched to this water supply, because it was all preventable. This was all man-made. But when we knew of the early signs of elevated lead levels, when we saw a few cases of Legionnaire's disease, people should have been alerted. Providers should have been alerted. Health advisories should have gone into effect. When we knew this was corroding engine parts, that should have been a red flag. So there were so many missed opportunities that for 18 months, people remained on this water source and suffered the consequences.
You had the unelected city managers, as you talked about, like Darnell Early. They also were indicted.
Yes. Yep, the emergency manager was indicted.
You had the City Council of Flint voting overwhelmingly to return to the original water supply, and the unelected manager saying, "How dare you do this?"
Right. Because we can't afford it, because poor people evidently are not good enough for clean water. Is this how our society is supposed to be? Shouldn't public welfare benefit all, no matter your privilege?
So you have the crisis of Flint water. And then you have the state of Michigan now approving a controversial permit to allow Nestle, the largest water bottling company in the world, to expand its operations in Michigan. Michigan's Department of Environmental Quality has given the okay to Nestle to withdraw 400 gallons a minute from the state's groundwater table, despite receiving over 80,000 public comments against the project. Nestle is not required to pay anything to extract this water, besides a small permitting fee to the state and the cost of leases to private landowners. According to one count, Nestle's bottled water is 7,000 times more expensive than what Nestle is actually paying for it. Critics say Nestle shouldn't be allowed to profit from the state's natural resources at a time when Michigan cities like Flint are still facing a crisis over contaminated water. When we went to Flint to talk about the poisoning of American City, we also went to the source of Nestle's water, because when we were in Flint, we were being handed bottled water everywhere. Companies were giving truckloads of bottled water to people, which was also great advertising for them. But more importantly, where was this water coming from? The issue of this bottled water, talk about it.
Amy, this is unreal. So the same week that the state granted Nestle this permit for $200 a year for unlimited access, essentially, to the Great Lakes, was the same week that they cut bottled water for Flint. There are people in Flint who still cannot afford water. They are, to this day, getting shutoffs because they cannot pay their bills for water that they still need to use a filter to drink from. And we grant a corporation unlimited access to the Great Lakes water. It is mind-boggling. It is tone-deaf. It is unreal for this to happen.
Flint, Michigan pediatrician Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. Her new book, What the Eyes Don't See, a story of crisis, resistance, and hope in an American city. If you'd like to go back to the documentary we did in Flint when we were there during the height of the crisis, you can go to democracynow.org and put into search "Thirsty for Democracy, the Poisoning of an American City." That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Has a job opening for a broadcast engineer. Check our website at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman.